and that they talk about the attitudes of farmers. There's some reluctance amongst the local farmers here. The farmers are managing in general to carry on without the help of women, this report says. As you can see, that's much lower than the Board of Trade returns for 1916. So again, you're getting different views of how many women are actually working by the middle years of the war. So the sort of comparable Board of Trade figure actually puts the figure virtually double what the Women's Committee figure is. Of the local women who worked on the land, you have to be careful about delineating the differences between them. Some of them worked full-time, some of them worked very much on a part-time or casual basis. Some of them were formed into gangs and just did seasonal work. Some of them worked across most of the year. You know, there were different pools of labour that we used. And of course, what we're not talking about is the women of farming families who are never included in any of these statistics. They're always left on the sidelines. So there does seem to be, you know, some success in encouraging local women to work on the land by the middle of the war. Although there's an acknowledgement that women are still reluctant to register. They don't like the registration system in some regions. They feel it's interfering with the nature of agriculture. So farmers don't like it because they don't like, you know, the intrusion into the ways that they operate. And women are sometimes a bit sceptical about the registration system and actually prefer to engage themselves with a farmer rather than going through the registration system. Okay, so let's move on to 1917. Why 1917? Those of you who are all working on aspects of food and farming and so on, you'll all know that 1917 is a particularly key year. So we've got a new Prime Minister, we've got a new President of the Board of Agriculture, Roland Prothero, is in place in early 1917. The Food Production Department is set up. The War Agricultural Committees, their function changes, and they now have more compulsion powers to make farmers plough up and so on. And as part of this, of course, in the background to all this is the fear of food shortages, the growing fear of food shortages by 1917, and also of labour shortages as well. The government are becoming more conscious that the numbers of workers on the land, we need more of them by this point. And as part of this general picture of change in early 1917, the government also forms the Women's Land Army. So the formation of the Women's Land Army at the start of 1917 is the Women's War Agricultural Committees, who are directed to recruit, train and place Women's Land Army members in their particular localities. That meant that the form and structure of the Women's Committees changed radically in 1917. They become much bigger. They form subcommittees, many subcommittees for recruitment, for training, and so on. And I've got a map or an image next of the Bedfordshire Women's War Agricultural Committees. Now, I could talk about the Bedfordshire Committee for a long time because a lot of their records survive, but I thought you might find that a bit weird if I came down to Devon to talk about Bedfordshire. Because all their minute books survive, what we're able to do is just map the change that takes place in the committee structure in 1917. So you can see all the different subcommittees that are set up. There's an executive, a committee for training and hostels, one for selection, there's actually a couple for selection, finance, and then as part of this whole scheme there's a Women's Institute, propaganda committee as it's called, by 1917. So you can see that their form and function is really changing the amount of effort that was put into organising the Women's Army at the local level was huge. It was really considerable. So they're instructed to set up local training centres with the cooperation of farmers and other providers such as local colleges. They have to find suitable lodgings for Land Army girls. They have to provide depots for billeting when they're between jobs. They have to train them. By 1918 they're offering efficiency tests, so they have to write up the syllabi for those tests and find examiners for them. Entertainment had to be provided because they were worried that, you know, if you've got mainly, not wholly, but mainly town-bred women in the Land Army, they wouldn't fit into rural life very well. So you have to socialise them, you have to provide them with welfare and entertainment and supervision. You have to provide them with transport to and from all these different farms and hostels and so on. Bedfordshire bought a load of bikes at one point so the Women's Land Army could use their push bikes to get to work. They had to appoint welfare supervisors and so on and so on. So the structure of the WACS was quite complex by 1917. So the Women's Land Army, it was a volunteer civilian force. It probably trained around 23,000 women overall between early 1917 and the end of 1919 when it was disbanded. At its peak, there were around 16,000 WLA women actually working on the land. Their numbers were always much, much smaller than the numbers of local women who were working. And they, you know, and that was probably quite deliberate because the WLA was a very different category of war worker. They were largely educated women. They received some training. It could be quite rudimentary, but they had some training. They received a free uniform, which famously included, you know, overcoats and boots and breeches, which outraged certain sections of rural society. They were mobile, so they were often sent from farm to farm. They were full-time workers. They worked the same hours as men. They were paid a minimum wage as well. As you can see, I think it started off actually in 18 shillings in 1917. It then rises to 20, and by 1919 they're earning 25 shillings. They're recruited for a minimum of 6 months. Most are recruited for 12 months, in fact. So you can see that the conditions that they're given is very different from the local resident woman worker. Okay. Having said that, most of them were found in traditional agricultural labour. A lot of the famous images of the Women's Land Army are of women with machinery, you know, women ploughing, you know, on tractors, plough women. You see that their numbers are actually very small. Most of what the Women's Land Army did was your, you know, typical working, milking, or at general field work. I think I just popped some images in to entertain us for a little bit, because of course the thing about the Women's Land Army is that it fascinated people. They fascinated people at the time, and they have carried on fascinating historians since. They were modern, okay? They wore a uniform, they were striking. You know, women with horses and ploughs wasn't used